Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we will be answering a question from our audience on: could you elaborate on China's transition from low-tech manufacturing to automation and the integration of AI, and how has this impacted its global competitiveness? Well, really what we have to answer here when breaking down this question is, what types of economies are there? And I'd really put it at three primary types of economy, and then you can differentiate a little bit within some of these types. You have the resource-based economy, and the prime example of this would really be Russia, although they have quite the manufacturing base as well. They are the most resource-rich country in the world. Then you have a manufacturing-based economy, which was the United States after World War II. But now I think the prime example of a manufacturing-based economy would really be China, and I think most people would agree with that. And then you have a service economy where you're not producing tangible goods typically. What you're doing is you're providing expert help in some way, shape, or form. And really even non-expert help. So something service economy based would maybe be like a waiter or waitress type of thing, where sure, they are bringing you a tangible good such as coffee, but their actual job is like it's service. They're not really doing much. A more high complexity, more education needed type of service job would be something like a therapist or counselor type of thing. And so that's the service economy. And the real stereotypical example of that in modern times is the United States. And the thing to remember here is the first two types of economies are based on tangible goods, and the last one is based on intangibles nearly entirely. And that's a concern, because at the end of the day, you have to make sure that people actually care about your intangibles. But we'll get into that. So let's start at the beginning. The first type of economy that we're going to look at is the resource-based economy. As I said, the resource-based economy is an economy that gets resources, or its entire economy, or the majority of its economy, is based off of resource extraction from its land. And so what you want is a lot of land that has a lot of resources in it, and then you can have a resource-based economy. Now, this is what I would consider the lowest level of advancement type of an economy, because of the fact that you're not really producing high-end goods or services. You're just extracting things that already exist from the land. And remember that this makes it so it's a finite economy. You only have an economy as long as you have resources within your land. I think nowadays there might even be an example or an instance of a resource-based economy where you have an infinite amount of the resources. So I'm thinking if a country becomes really proficient in the production of renewable energies, then you could say in that instance that they are a resource-based economy, a high-tech resource-based economy that produces infinite of their resource. So that's something interesting that is kind of developing. But for right now, resource-based economy is kind of the most simplistic type of economy. And unfortunately, Russia, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, would really be considered, I would say, solidly in the resource-based economy camp. You can probably consider other countries like Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states. They're really resource-based economies. And not only that, but they're a one resource-based economy. They're based off of entirely the production of finite energy goods such as oil. Then the second type of economy to look at, and this is where China went after the communists won the civil war in China, was low-tech manufacturing. And low-tech manufacturing is, you might have some basic manufacturing plants, things like that, but you don't have really the technical know-how, the expertise for what I would call high-tech manufacturing, which I'll get into in a second. And low-tech manufacturing involves, it's very labor-intensive. It involves a lot of people sacrificing a lot. Typically, it's pretty unsafe working conditions, relatively similar to the resource-based economy. And the reason it's the resource-based economy is typically more unsafe working conditions is because of the fact that if countries become more advanced, they typically pivot away from being entirely a resource-based economy and diversify into goods that have goods that are more infinite, or goods that you can create more of, whereas the resource-based economy is the most finite of the economies. With manufacturing, you can at least pivot to creating other products if you run out of certain products. And so there's a more infinite nature to the manufacturing economy. And so low-tech manufacturing, China, very smartly, I would say, used its primary resource. It was the largest country in the world for a lot of the 20th century. And so they made sure that they used that labor in order to produce a lot of goods. And so you could say slowly or quickly, depending on if you're looking at years or decades or centuries, they became a manufacturing powerhouse. And really, people pretty derogatorily said that that China was the world sweatshop, and they were just producing a lot of junk goods, trinkets, things like that. And I mean, for a couple of decades, that might have been true, but China did something else. And so China made the transition to a high-tech manufacturing company. And so when we're talking about China transitioning from low-tech manufacturing to automation, we have to also mention where they're currently at, which is the high-tech manufacturing. And what I consider to be high-tech manufacturing, that's something like going from a ton of workers producing things entirely by hand to having maybe some robotics into the mix, having one person being able to do the job of multiple people due to more technology being incorporated into the production process, but they're still making goods. They're still making primarily tangible goods. And so China's there right now. They're producing a lot of high-tech manufacturing goods, and people didn't notice a transition. I would really say during the pandemic was around 2019, 2020, 2021 was when people and nations started to recognize, like, oh, actually, China doesn't just make cheap trinkets anymore. They're making a lot of really, really high-tech goods. And so that was the pivot point, I would say. Around the late 2010s is probably a good point to put it. And now what China is trying to do is they're trying to pivot to automation AI, which we'll get into in a second. But the high-tech manufacturing economy is something where, and I should mention this with both types of manufacturing, where you're dependent on getting resources either from your own land, in which case you still have to be at least partially a resource-based economy, or you have to have deep connections with other people, other governments that have a lot of resources. And so this is, and we've talked about this in other videos, where we get the idea of the United States wanting to keep the United States in to Europe, Germany down, and Russia out of Europe. And the reason for that was because of they didn't want German manufacturing to be paired with Russian natural resources. And China, recognizing that they wanted to climb up the economy complexity ladder, said, we are low-tech manufacturing. We need access to goods. We want to become high-tech manufacturing. What do we do? And what they did was they settled their differences, their disputes with Russia, some territorial disputes there, and they made peace. And so you have the pairing of Russia's natural resources with China's manufacturing capacity, and that was something that allowed China to go from low-tech manufacturing to high-tech manufacturing. Now China is recognizing, and I guess I'll just go to automation AI and I can come back to the service economy later. China is recognizing that they still want to be producing tangible goods. They're very hesitant about service economies. And because of that, they also recognize that they have a population crisis there. Their fertility rate is extremely low. You need to have every 2 people need to produce something like 2.1 more people in order to sustain the population. And that's because it's 2.1 instead of 2 because like some people die early before they can start reproducing. And so you kind of have a 0.1 extra people just to make sure that your population is sustained. And a lot of countries, a lot of industrialized countries, and even the developing world at this point has fertility rates below 2.1. And so China is extremely concerned about that. I should also mention here that China had justifiable reasons for having a low fertility rate. They had to have the one-child policy, and people are upset about the one-child policy. They don't like it. They don't understand why it needed to occur. I do believe it did need to occur, but I do think it may have lasted a decade or two more than it should have. The reason it needed to occur was because when you have a large population, you need to be able to concentrate resources and develop that population. And if you have too many people producing too many more people, it's really hard to build a foundation with which to grow your country from. And so China needed to slow the birth rate for at least a few decades in order to make sure that it can actually sustain its population and grow and develop the country as a whole. And so they did that, but I think they kept the policy a little bit too long. And because of that, and because some other factors just related to being a developing, soon-to-be developed nation, the fertility rate is extremely low. And so China is focusing on automation AI right now in order to make sure that even when their working age population is declining, that they still have ways of producing tangible goods. And we're really starting to realize a divide here between the East and West, where the West went to completely intangibles and they expected people to buy into that entirely, and the East said, no, we're going to produce tangible goods, things that you can actually touch, feel, use. And they gambled, and I think the East won at this. People are, particularly in times of crisis, they want tangible goods. You can think of a clear example of this, and I hate to rip on poor Mark Zuckerberg here, but his metaverse idea, I think the metaverse is a great idea and will eventually work, but he didn't understand the market at the time, and he lost billions of dollars for his company Meta pivoting to the metaverse idea, even calling Facebook metaverse now. And I believe that that is entirely because of the fact that he was pivoting towards the Western idea of us going to completely virtual, completely intangibles, and the East recognized, no, this is not a time for that. It's a time of chaos, a time of instability, and people want tangible things, and so they focus on that. And so China is using things like automation AI to produce more tangible goods using fewer workers, more high-quality workers who are more educated, et cetera, et cetera. And so that gets us through talking about resource-based economies, low-tech, high-tech manufacturing, and China's pivot towards automation AI. But I'd really be doing a disservice here if I didn't talk about the intangible economy, which America is banking on, that I don't think is going to be particularly successful in the long term. It's worked so far, but in the long term, they need to have actual tangible goods, and that is the service economy. So United States jumped from high-tech manufacturing after World War II to being a service economy. And service economies, typically, it's something like people do things for you. That's what a service economy is. They're not giving you a tangible good. They're doing things for you, typically. And that type of economy works if people value your services, if people value the work that you're doing for them, such as if you're doing a good job as a therapist or something like that. However, I don't think you can base an economy entirely off of that. And I think the United States recognizes that to a certain extent because they've also become a very financialized economy where a lot of their economy is not only based off of services offered, but also really just moving around ones and zeros and decimal places on computers and saying that more money exists in the system, more goods exist in the system. Their economy is heavily based upon what I would call gambling. It's speculation in the financial markets, the stock markets, things like that. And so the service economy, I think, should make up, obviously, a portion of a healthy country's economy, and China recognizes this. But once you let the service economy, particularly the intangible aspects of the service economy, take over your country, you're entirely dependent on people actually valuing the services offered. And if you're not producing tangible goods, you better have a country that you trust producing the tangible goods for you. And guess what? United States right now does not have that. United States has a very antagonistic relationship with the country producing the tangible goods, and that is China. And so we see here kind of, I would say, archetypes or stereotypical examples of each of these economies. Resource-based, Russia; manufacturing, all types of manufacturing; low-tech, was what China was previously. High tech is what China is currently, and they're pivoting towards the automation AI type of manufacturing. And I think they're doing a very good job of it. There are some examples of AI where they're behind, things like generative AI. They're not doing as well in that. So large language models. China should be doing extremely well at this because of the fact that they have a large population and a lot of data to use to create these large language models, but they just haven't. They're a couple of years behind, but they will definitely catch up there. And so their focus on really tangible production of goods, and then the United States is focused entirely on service economy, financialized economy, things like that. Whereas Russia and China are banking on the real economy being the important aspect of the future. And so far, it does seem like Russia and China are correct here. United States is declining very rapidly, and a lot of countries are moving away from the United States, especially moving away from the US dollar and trading either in local currencies or in the ruble or in the Chinese yuan. So that is my answer to this question on could you elaborate on China's transition from low-tech manufacturing to automation and integration of AI and how this has impacted its global competitiveness. It's been very successful in terms of how competitive it is. I think they made the right choice there, focusing on the real economy versus the financialized economy, which we'll talk about more in a separate segment. And I also think that they were correct in focusing on tangible goods versus focusing on the more intangible services that the United States focuses on. So that is my answer to this question. I hope you liked this video, and if you did like it, please actually like the video. And if you want to hear more from me, please subscribe to our channel. We're going to be doing a lot of new, interesting things in the future. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, please put it in the comments box on YouTube or Rumble or whichever video platform that you're watching this on. And I read all of them, and I will be responding to all of them. So I appreciate all your comments, questions, concerns. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with more in the future. Bye.